Welcome to Real Clear Politics. I'm A.B. Stoddard. Recent polls show that almost 9 out of 10 Americans favor the legalization of cannabis. 21 states have legalized it for recreational purposes, while 37 states and territories have legalized it for medical use. At the federal level, a number of proposals have been made to create a framework for dealing with the fast-changing nature of state cannabis laws. These efforts have largely been bipartisan, and on today's program, we'll talk with 3 Republican members who have been on the forefront of those discussions. Representative David Joyce is a former prosecutor who represents Ohio's 14th District, and he co-chairs the Congressional Cannabis Caucus. Brian Mast was wounded while serving in Afghanistan and now represents Florida's 18th District, and along with Joyce is co-chair of the Congressional Cannabis Caucus. And Nancy Mace represents South Carolina's 1st Congressional District and is ranking member on the House Subcommittee on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, held hearings last month on decriminalization of cannabis at the federal level. We start with my interview with Dave Joyce, which was taped earlier. I talked with him about several things, including why a former prosecutor is now in favor of cannabis reform and what the prospects are for action in the current lame duck session. Congressman Joyce, great to have you with us on this really fascinating topic. You've worked with several Democrats on this issue now. One of them, Senator Cory Booker, said recently he believes if Congress wants to pursue marijuana reform, they must do it now, which means during the lame duck session in the coming weeks, or wait until, quote, many years from now. Do you think he's right? Is there a chance that something could pass before the end of this session?
Well, I think the good part is that the Senate majority remained intact, which gave them more runway toward the ends of the year. Obviously, there's going to be a change come January 3rd. They would have had other things on their menu versus cannabis. But I know that there's been a lot of hard work put in by Senator Schumer and the likes of Senator Booker, Senator Daines, obviously, and others to try to put together something that would pass through in the lame duck. And I hope that they continue to stay consistent to what I've been told today.
And how much does change in control of the House with Republicans and the majority make it more difficult to advance the case for legalization at the federal level?
Well, I think that hopefully some of these things will get accomplished at the end of this term. And so then what we'll be left to in the next term would be figuring out, sort of sanding off the rough edges, if you will. If there's things as in the implementation of any of these type of things, it'll be interesting to see what finally makes it through the Senate and what doesn't. And then we'll have to review that and create packages, if you will, that would, or targeted bills that will fix the problems that might be brought up or might be unforeseen with some of the things that gets passed at the end of this year.
And in your state, you're a former prosecutor from Ohio. In your state, cannabis use is legal for medical reasons, but not for recreational use. How did you come to be interested in this issue and become an advocate for this?
Well, for my time as a prosecutor, I didn't see necessarily the cannabis activity being something that was considered cartel-like. I realized that, unfortunately, the way money was coming from the feds to the state and then the states to local authorities was through grants. Grants require stats. The stats were going out and picking up 4 knuckleheads who were behind the bar. It was pretty easy to do. Sit in the parking lot, they come out, you see the car light go on, give it about 2 minutes, and then you got a forfeit, right? No. And so I just kept telling cops, and I realized what they were doing. We're not taking those cases anymore. Just ask them where they got it, take whatever they've got, dump it, and just say, look, where'd you get it? And then start working on the dealers, so people where they were getting it from. When we heard the same name consistently, then start to invest our time and energy in going after the people who were actually purveyors of the, and usually they weren't just on cannabis, there was other things that they were selling too. And it took a while, but finally the law enforcement folks understood where I was going with this, and they started to get into some major seizures of cocaine. At that time, cocaine was the big thing, or crystal meth. Unfortunately, that turned into opioids and fentanyl as time went on. But so when I got here, that was sort of the background on when I got to the Congress. And I was in an appropriations hearing, and Congressman Sam Farr from out in, at that time, he was in Monterey, California, was making the argument where in California, where it's medically illegal, the local VA hospitals could not prescribe it to the vets who suffer from PTSD. And he made a great argument. And I thought, hell, if it helps these people, then who are we to say no, right? Doctors are willing to sit down and prescribe it to their people. California lets the prescription. And I was the only Republican who voted yes. Within 30 minutes upon returning to my office, I got a call from then Speaker Boehner asking me what the hell I was doing. Summoned me to his office and asked me what the hell I was doing. And I explained to him, first and foremost, I believe it's a states' rights issue. And secondly, I went through the same analogy. Who the hell are we to be telling these people, if it helps them, God bless them. These people put their life on the line for our country. If it helps them, well, they should get it. And he said, don't do it again. And I said, well, okay. So, a funny little aside quickly is that when John finally got into the industry, I guess, at some point after he retired, I texted him that, by the way, I believe that if you need any help, congratulations. If you need any help getting up to speed, be glad to bring you up to speed. And he said, thank you. And I said, and I still believe it's a states' rights issue. And he called me, he said, and I still believe you're a shithead, which was his normal term of endearment to me. So it's amazing how far we've come, I guess, and to be truthful, in D.C., although it's been a decade that I've been here now, this is one thing that's moved at jet-like speed compared to the glacial pace at which this place operates.
I was going to ask you about Brother Boehner. You obviously are responsible for converting him, and that's a wonderful story. What is, just to expand on that, you said it's a states' rights issue. What is the conservative or Republican argument for legalizing cannabis at the federal level?
Well, if you believe in the Constitution, you believe in states' rights, then this is a perfect example of how states have exercised their rights, and the federal government should get the hell out of their way. All we're doing is creating a position now that is untenable with, what are we up to now, 47 states or territories where in some way, shape, or form it's legal. And we still don't allow access to bank, even though these are legal corporations working under the regulations and statutory framework that have been set up by each state. And yet they can't have a bank account, that they can't use banking system in order to facilitate the business that they're transacting every day, that they can't use the tax code. I mean, it's insane, and it's only got progressively worse as the industry has increased in size throughout the country. So I think it's very important that we continue to let the laboratories of the states be the expansion of this, and either step in front of it and put together a framework like my Prepare Act that says bring all the parties to the table and develop a system that works and create the same type of network that you have available for the alcohol industry. And it's not reinventing the wheel, but create the same type of regulatory framework that allows it to operate in all 50 states if the state sees fit.
So the argument for a federal framework is, even though it's a states' rights issue, is that they are creating their own systems, but you're making the case that without being a part of the banking system, this is problematic for the states. And then also you're making another argument that we need to have some kind of regulation for use and for minors. Could you expand on why that requires a federal response and how that can help for health reasons and for societal challenges, for law enforcement, everything like that?
Well, you got to look at the areas, AB, where you have uniform agreement. Uniform agreement on kids not getting access to it. Similar to alcohol, similar to tobacco. Kids don't have access unless it's properly medically dosed for someone having seizures or something along those lines. Obviously, then people don't have a disagreement with that. One of the things, as it becomes legal in every state, people are under the influence potentially when they're operating a vehicle. How do police know that? How do you test for that? And so without having the handcuffs the federal system has put on has not allowed for the proper research to be done to know when somebody's under the influence, such as an alcohol. You're influenced at 0.2 and you're under the influence at 0.8 in Ohio. There's standards set that people know what's reasonable, what's not reasonable. Obviously, people are going to have to be a little bit under the influence if they have it medically prescribed, but the doctors are going to know and prescribe them that, and most likely they're told not to operate the vehicles too. But still, there's no set standard now. It's uniform throughout the country. The other place where I think that's really important is for the employers. that more and more employers are just waiving it now because they realize the amount of folks that they're going to have to fire when they have a hard time finding employees who might imbibe on a Friday and show up Monday morning. Well, the guy who watched his favorite football game the day before and down to a fifth of liquor, he's fine. He can come to work. But somebody who might have been influenced by it on Friday night is now, because it's still in the system, can't work there because of insurance purposes and been fired. So I just think it's high time we do the things that are necessary, putting the guardrails around to make sure kids don't get it, to make sure it's not near schools or being unduly influenced to youth, to making sure that we have the research done so people understand what it is good for, what it's not good for, and be able to make some intelligent decisions with facts versus the speculation that's taken place since the 30s when they had that crazy movie about people driving off cliffs and becoming monsters because they've engaged.
So a recent survey by the Coalition for Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation found that 58% of Republicans favor ending the federal prohibition on cannabis use. Where do you find the challenges in convincing more of your Republican colleagues? Do you think they're going to continue to listen to the polls? You said it's one of the swiftest directions of change you've seen in recent memory, or do you think that it's likely that we maintain the status quo? What's the argument? What are the hurdles to getting around convincing Republicans on this issue?
Education is certainly a key part of it. Andy Harris, who's just had a bill that he did with Earl Blumenauer, passed the Senate yesterday on research. When I first was going back and forth with him in a hearing in appropriations on a criminal justice services matter, he was saying, well, we want more research. And I think he was floored with it. We want more research. He said, well, we can't get the research because otherwise they're using some stale plants that are grown in Mississippi at a DEA farm. Every state's independent. Every state is growing it. In the first seeds fall like manna from heaven, I guess. I don't know where they come from, but every state seems to have their own productions that just starts to take place. So it's going to be a little bit different. And if we're going to have something that's medicinal, then people in Ohio who then move to California should know when they buy it in California, it's the same thing that they were buying in Ohio and vice versa. I mean, let's face it, if you take aspirin here, you take it there, you're getting aspirin. You're not getting something that's going to be different, produce different results that you're not used to. So I think it's important to have that research as well as for the other reasons that I brought up before. It's finding out where people are at and meeting their expectation or disabusing them of some of the things. And some of it you're never going to get out. I had a conversation with somebody who didn't like the fact that his state was legal and the next state wasn't. And people were coming into his border town and ruining it by showing up there. And I guess they were cutting the high as soon as they walked out of the place. I don't know. But he seemed to think that it was just corrupting his little city. Okay, I get that. I mean, there's not a hell of a lot I could do about that. But, I get that. But the other folks, a lot of you get pushback from, especially older folks, saying, well, it's a gateway drug. I get it, but people with addictive personalities, they get addicted to alcohol or other influences too. I mean, it's gambling. It's hard to say if it is or not, but it's certainly, when I first focused on this, when I got here, I was coming from the view, opioids. And we weren't going to get, if this was providing pain relief for people and it was a hell of a lot less addictive than opioids, then why weren't we prescribing it? Why weren't we dealing with this? And that's why I think it's important to get that research and get it done and explain to them that, look, I watched my father, a World War II veteran who was shot and left for dead, dying. All the poor guy wanted was a meal, to be able to eat because he was dying of cancer. For God's sakes, if that would have helped him, give it to him. They'd give him all the drugs so he could hardly, he didn't feel a thing. And I guess that's a strategy when you go into hospice. But I really think we should just get out of the way of experts and let them determine when it's good. And when you talk to people through their issue like that, then they feel it a little bit more. Or they happen to know somebody, kid who's suffering seizures, who happens to use it and it stopped the seizures. I mean, it's important to find out where people are at and direct their attention to things that we're trying to get cured by doing this once and for all.
So in terms of the rapid growth of people in favor, You said in 2019, which is just a few short years ago, you did not think in your lifetime that you would see legalization of cannabis use at the federal level. Have you changed your mind? Do you think there's hope? What are your thoughts on whether or not more corners have been turned just in the last few years?
Well, AB, I'm a Cleveland Browns fan. We're eternally hopeful that someday we're going to make it to the Super Bowl, for God's sake. There's certain winds of change that have come in. You look at our new class, there are a lot of people who are younger. They've coming from, a lot of them from state legislatures where they've seen it implemented and they haven't seen the fiction that goes around with, everybody's going to go crazy and nobody's going to want to go to work and that type of thing. But the thing that's moving it also is the fact that these states have then taxed it. And I remember the first time I saw it in Colorado, and they had $30 million in taxes in the first month there. What governor is going to walk away from a fount of money that he doesn't have to really tax his citizens for? They're willing to pay it. And so there's a lot of components to it that is just going to take time to walk people through, but they're moving much more quickly. And the states obviously are moving much more quickly than the federal government, who still wants to bury her head in the sand and pretend it's 1960. And, it's important for people. One of the reasons, the things that we've been doing is trying to put it out there. Unlike the MORE Act, where you have an all-inclusive thing, our position has been putting out bills and trying to hit people, like I said, meeting them where they're at. And so they get comfortable with it and they get the bills in a patchwork way moving forward. And you can see that taking place now. And what Senator Schumer's trying to do is put together the pieces and parts that he can get a willing coalition. Because the MORE Act passed the House with great fanfare. Where'd it go? Nowhere. So the idea was, all right, let's get something that's not only going to get through the House, but get through the Senate and get to the president's desk for signature. And when you realize that, then President Biden, he's in that zone where, obviously, unfortunately, drugs have affected his family.
Yeah.
So he's not coming to this as a willing participant necessarily. He's coming to it because he's been told, and he's advocated that he would do such a thing if it was to him. But I got to admit, it's, probably number 100 if he had a top 100 list of things he wants to get accomplished in his presidency.
Congressman Joyce, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a terrific discussion, and we really appreciate your participation. Next, I want to welcome Republican Brian Mast to the studio, who represents Florida's 18th district. So, Congressman, your colleague in the Senate on this issue, Senator Cory Booker, said that if nothing happens on this issue in the lame duck, he doesn't think anything will happen for many years. Your colleague, Congressman Joyce, told me he does not believe it's probably top on the list of priorities for President Joe Biden in the next couple of weeks in the lame duck session before the Democrats lose the House of Representatives. What do you think is possible in the lame duck session on cannabis reform?
So possible to move cannabis reform. The Senate could take up policy that was taken up in this last Congress if they wanted to. They haven't had the desire to do so. That's the Senate side. The House of Representatives side could still take up, say, a Nancy Mace bill, something like that, something very strict on just decriminalization, descheduling of cannabis. I don't think it's entirely likely that be what they take up in the lame duck session. But for me personally, I think that's why, for my assessment, it's more likely in the next Congress. Because speaking from, to give some inside baseball, there's a huge push in my conference, in my delegation, to move forward bills that people can very easily understand. And what I mean by saying that is that they're straightforward. You're not mixing cannabis policy with something else relating to energy policy, with something else in 1,000 or 1,500 pages of legislation. You're putting forward something that's straightforward, that says decriminalization, states' rights. We're not going to argue about the Commerce Clause in this way like everybody likes to do. And it's straightforward. Or you could take your host of issues. That is really the push in our delegation right now, to have those simple, straightforward pieces of legislation, so that people can know exactly what their representatives are, in fact, standing up for, supporting, voting on, and then sending that over to the Senate to say, hey, make a simple up or down decision on this. So I'm actually more hopeful.
Okay, and you co-sponsored the Veterans Equal Access bill in June. How and why have veterans been denied access to cannabis? And you are also, you lost both your legs in the Afghanistan war. Why, from a personal perspective, is this important for veterans? And what would your bill do to address the fact that this is right now prohibited for them?
Yeah. So when we say personal perspective, personally, I'm not a cannabis user. I've never been. I have a lot of fellow veterans that are. Whenever I go into the Department of Veterans Affairs, into the hospital, which is where I get all of my own care, I hear pretty much every time from somebody that wants to speak about this issue. I have friends that I served with that are now out of the military and around the country from all branches of the military. When they want to talk to me, this is one of the biggest issues that they want to talk about, is saying, hey, why can't I have this access through the Department of Veterans Affairs to help me with post-traumatic stress, to help me with pain in this way, to help me with anxiety in this way? Why do I have to be on this product of pharma? Why can't I have what some people would classify as an alternative medicine, something that I believe in more? Why does it have to be this that comes with this laundry list of my kidneys aren't going to work and my liver's going to fail and I might die if I take this and this together? Why can't we try something different? And that's what has to be able to happen here. And it's not allowed to happen, to answer your question simply, because of the way that marijuana is scheduled, the way that cannabis is scheduled in the federal system. That's why it can't happen. That's why the VA, being a federal agency, won't allow this to move forward. And this is something that we can change and that we should change, not just for the betterment of veterans, but there's a host of individuals that you can look at in the medical sphere. And that's what so many states have been looking at, among many other things.
And Senator Hickenlooper, a Democrat, has introduced the PREPARE Act in the other chamber. It mirrors legislation that you've introduced in the House. Can you tell us what the PREPARE Act and your bill do and why they are important?
Yeah, so you look forward and you say, okay, we're going to allow the Department of Veterans Affairs to have prescriptions for individuals. They can go through the VA to be treated in a way that cannabis is part of that treatment. That's something that we can and should be allowing. This is what we're pushing forward in that, again, but the best pathway forward has to be descheduling to make this work across the board, because what you run into, even though you're dealing with a federal agency, is you run into, let's look at what's gone on the 2022 ballots, right? You had states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Arkansas say on their individual state ballots that they did not want to legalize cannabis use. You had states like Maryland and Missouri say that they do want to legalize cannabis use. Well, if your Department of Veterans Affairs is issuing a card or a prescription to a veteran, but your state law is crossed with what the VA is doing, that puts you in a bad situation. It puts you in a bad situation for a concealed carry permit. It puts you in a bad situation for employment, for insurance, for a host of different things. So we can do this through the VA, and we're going to work on that, but we have to get this done at a much higher level federally for sending this to states across the board.
And on that issue, why do we need federal reform if it's a state's issue? And is there a danger that federal involvement hampers changes in the laws that are being passed at the state level? If the Republican Party is the party of states' rights and they have their unique needs and rights, where does the federal legalization argument come in? What is the Republican conservative argument, federalist argument for legalizing at the federal level?
The argument to say don't do this always comes back to the same old, interstate commerce. It's got to be interstate commerce. Federal government has to have total control of this for this reason. And this is, the auspices by which they chose to do this many years ago. That's not sound arguments. Do not give this right back to the states to go out there and decide. We already had, 31 states already make the decision to legalize cannabis in their states. Some have made the decision to not legalize cannabis, but that is the pinnacle getting to decide. It goes and takes the power out of the federal government, out of my hands as one of 435 U.S. representatives, out of the hands of the the senators in our bicameral body, and says it's going to go to your state legislature, your state house, your state senate, your governors, and they're much closer to you. They're going to decide that for you. That has to be the way. You can't let that interstate commerce argument get in the way of that. Because it's not a consistent argument. It's something that the government loves to use as a blanket on everything to take control. And as a representative, I can tell you that I have yet to see the federal government work overtime to try to give control back to the people. That's what I want to see. I wanted to see that in, a lot of people have arguments in this way, but it's consistent for the Republican argument. You heard us all talk about, hey, we agree with the Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade because things should go back to the states. Well, if you were a Republican and you were talking about that Supreme Court decision in that way, then in my opinion, you should be consistent and talk about cannabis legislation in that way and sending it back to the states and a host of other issues. But that's certainly one that was recently in the news.
And so, Congressman, now that the Republicans are taking over the House majority and controlling the chamber, what has changed, in your opinion, in terms of prospects for reform? Is it more favorably disposed with Republicans or less? What is the argument you're making to your Republican colleagues about pushing ahead with this issue? And what's the resistance that you're meeting?
Yeah, so I think the argument gets stronger and stronger every day. It gets stronger with the arguments that were going on during this last political cycle. I just brought up the argument of Roe v. Wade. If you are arguing in this way and you want to be consistent, then argue that same way with cannabis reform. That makes the argument easier when people have to wait. Well, I guess I did talk about states' rights in this issue. So then explain to me what is actually different, because I'm not seeing what is. So be consistent and apply that same policy in the same way. That makes it easier to move legislation if we can have arguments in that way. But like I said, one of the things that in my opinion gives us a greater ability to advance this in this Republican House of Representatives is going to be our internal push to have simple up or down votes on a myriad of issues that sit in the federal hands right now, from border to immigration policy to a host of other things. Well, let's have those same kind of simple up or down votes on descheduling or what will be scheduled for cannabis. And that gives it a higher prospect, in my opinion.
And what is the kind of arguments from opponents that you are hearing? Are you making progress in that area? But also, what are the arguments that are made in terms of resisting moving forward with legalization? Is it concern for use by minors? What is the resistance that you're coming up against among your colleagues?
So some of the big cases that you hear is simply harm to the body, and which, again, it's a non-consistent argument. When you say tobacco is legalized, alcohol is legalized, you can find those that use something, you can find those that abuse something in nearly anything that somebody can consume in life, right down to things that sit inside of everybody's kitchen. You can use or you can abuse, and you can't use that, as many people do, as the argument to say, well, because there's a potential that somebody would abuse something, we're going to not allow any use of something whatsoever. That is the argument that gets made constantly, probably the biggest one, hands down. Now, going back to some of those states that had this on the ballot and that will have this on other ballots, if you have a state that moves this on its state ballot, like Maryland or like Missouri, well, that's going to move your federal representatives to also vote differently if they're given the opportunity to vote at the federal level to decriminalize, to deschedule that. So that's something that helps as well. But hands down, the health, what could this lead to for an individual? What are the side effects? One of the other big ones that people bring up is a difference in potency today versus a potency in, let's say, 1975. That's one of the arguments that's brought to me fairly regularly.
And what's your response? Because we all hear this argument. What is your response about the difference in potency now versus years ago?
My response is that to use that same word, consistency. Be consistent again, because we're not looking to say that if I want to go to a bar, I have to have this beer that's 8% alcohol by volume, or I can't have this one that's brewed in a whiskey barrel that's this percent alcohol by volume, or this spirit or this spirit or this spirit. You're not making the argument consistently to me if you haven't been writing legislation to rein that in the exact same way. So again, it's just be consistent. To my colleagues on either side of the aisle, be consistent with what your policies are over here and apply those to cannabis legislation, and you will find yourself in the camp of saying it needs to be decriminalized. Veterans need to have access in the VA. Individuals across the country need to have access based upon what their states are saying, and that's the boat that we get to.
So the most recent Pew Research poll from October showed 88% of Americans support legalization for recreational and medical use. You mentioned Maryland and Missouri just passing ballot initiatives in this most recent election, and you're making the case that more and more states approving this will lead to more and more support from their federal representatives. Why is Congress still so far behind the public and the states on this issue in 2022?
Well, whenever Congress is behind on something like that, make no mistake, it is a conscious decision. It's not as that, there was just too many other things that were on the ballot, and so we didn't take that. No, if that stuff wants to go through the Judiciary Committee for decriminalization, well, it can be moved through the Judiciary Committee pretty rapidly, or put on the agenda pretty rapidly for 2 months from now or 5 months from now. It can be done if the will is there. There are always people that want to be protected from taking what they consider quote unquote tough votes, because they don't want to have to piss off half the people on one side and half the people on the other side. So they're going to put pressure to say, hey, please don't bring this to the floor. Please don't bring this to committee, because we don't want to have to take that vote. That's always one of the inside baseball problems that you get. There's always pressure from lobbying interests, right? Just like there's an interest that wants to see more of a libertarian approach, a states' rights approach to this. And that is good for the cannabis business to have that approach. There's another side of it that doesn't want to see this unless it's going to fall under models that are going to benefit them in terms of their revenue, not take away from whatever pharmaceutical sales, or not take away from whatever recreational sales that somebody's ingesting currently in this sphere. And so if legalization will take away from that, then somebody's going to be pushing away from that. And that's unfortunately, but realistically, the way that Washington works.
Okay, so it makes a lot of sense. You said that your delegation is interested in prioritizing standalone legislation that people can understand, that's not confused by being connected to other issues and controversial items. If you could pass one incremental reform for cannabis in this last session of Congress, or by the end of the session of Congress, what would that reform be?
It would be decriminalized. That is it's the gold standard, but it's the baseline for what needs to happen as well. That's the middle of the road, in my opinion. People always say, "Well, how do you be middle? How do you be centrist?" And my answer to individuals is always this: I think the most centrist, the most middle that somebody can be is to be constitutional. And there can certainly be constitutional arguments made either way, but in my opinion, that's what reins people in from the left, from the right. The Constitution is and my interpretation of that says that the Constitution deems this is an issue that should belong to the states. So let's give it to the states. And the states have already been begging for this in terms of voting on it. Voting on it in their own state legislatures is begging to have control of it. Whether they vote yes or vote no, it's saying they want to have a hand in making the determination for the state of Missouri or the state of Maryland or Arkansas or North Dakota, South Dakota, Florida, whatever state it may be. They want to have that hand.
Congressman Mast, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your service.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Next, I spoke by Zoom with Nancy Mace, who represents South Carolina's 1st District, about her views on cannabis reform. Congresswoman Mace, thank you so much for joining us today. You have been a really important voice in this movement. You flipped a Democratic seat in South Carolina in 2020 and then just were reelected there by 14 points, which is an enormous margin. Where has your support for cannabis reform registered in terms of your electoral prospects, your campaigns, your interest from your constituents? Did it hurt you? Did it harm you? What is the story with cannabis and among your voters?
I would tell you that the only place that cannabis is controversial is right here on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., or any state capital that hasn't made progression in cannabis reform at the state level. When I ran for my primary this year, one of the very first ads my opponent did was hitting me on cannabis. And yet it's been Republicans in the state of South Carolina and our state legislature. It's been Republicans at the state level who've been leading the effort to do cannabis reforms in South Carolina. So I would say to anybody who's a Republican who it doesn't support cannabis reform is on the wrong side of this issue, whether you live in a blue state or a red state. I'll take South Carolina, for example. Statewide, medical cannabis is supported by the vast majority of Republicans. In my district, not only is medical cannabis supported by the vast majority of people on both sides of the aisle, but so is recreational and adult use. And, for me, even though they ran ads against me on the issue, I won my primary or my Republican primary overwhelmingly against all of those odds. And so it's just, again, a testament to how not controversial the issue is if you're talking about it in a responsible manner. When you're talking about it with regards to drug addiction, opioids, it is an off-ramp to many types of addiction. I've seen it in my own family, as well as South Carolinians and Americans across the country. I've seen how much good use you can get out of it when used responsibly. And so it's an issue that I've talked about for a number of years before I ever came to Congress. I was a leader on the issue in the state legislature. I've been a leader on the issue in Congress. I put my money where my mouth is and have stood the test of all those challenges of folks against me that say I go too far or don't go far enough. I think we're right where we need to be in representing the values of every South Carolinian.
Well, if it can make it there, maybe it can make it anywhere. That's fascinating. You did say during a recent hearing on Capitol Hill that happened after the election that this plant literally saved my life. And you tell a very compelling personal story. What did you mean by that? And
I've talked about this over the last 2 or 3 years, but I was raped when I was 16. And that sent me into a tailspin. It was a trauma that I never thought I could ever get through. And I dropped out of high school at the time. And my doctor prescribed me antidepressants. Well, I learned that antidepressants, some of them can make your depression worse. So I had to stop taking the prescription drugs. And unbeknownst to me, I was self-medicating with cannabis. I took it for about a year or so, give or take, more or less. And it cut my anxiety. I felt better about life. I had a better quality of sleep at the time. And so when I talk about the issue, especially when I'm talking to veterans, I understand that pain and their desperation to get something that can be helpful and save their life because I've been there. I've experienced it. And now come to find out that there are all these benefits, whether it's neurological, if you have Parkinson's, whether it's pain, chronic pain and getting off of opioids, whether it's just recreational use and it's not a dangerous addictive drug like so many people on the wrong side of this issue like to argue. The data just doesn't back it up. And so I've had my own personal experiences with it. It literally saved my life. I wouldn't be here today if I had continued to take those prescription drugs. I mean, you have doctors today, and the opioid crisis is worse than it's ever been, who can literally prescribe you heroin. And yet in a lot of states like South Carolina, they can't give you a 2 or 4 milligram gummy that's going to not make you high, but at least cut your anxiety, allow you to sleep at night and not be addicted to opioids. And so to me, it just makes so much sense and it's responsible. And there's no reason not to at this point.
You've made the case for states' rights and the protection of our federal system through your States Reform Act. Why do you think a framework for federal legalization is necessary?
Well, if you're going to get Republicans on board, you have to look at ways to make this a bipartisan issue. And one of the ways that the vast majority of people, whether they're Republican or Democrat, whether elected or unelected, is by allowing states to take the lead on the issue. The vast majority of Americans, even in South Carolina, they respect the rights of states to make their own decisions on cannabis legalization and reforms. And so that's the first step in having a bipartisan bill. You cannot pass cannabis reform in the U.S. Congress without it passing the House and the Senate. And by the way, the House will be controlled by Republicans in a couple of weeks, and the Senate will continue to be controlled by Democrats. And so when you have that kind of majority split like that, you've got to make sure your legislation, no matter what it is, cannabis or not related, has to be bipartisan and has to be bicameral if it's going to get to the president's desk to be signed into law. And that's the first step, is ensuring that you look at what both sides want and address those issues. And that is one way to make it bipartisan, to get Republicans on board. Whether they agree or disagree with cannabis, I think we can all agree that it's a states' rights issue. And putting that framework in place, allowing states to make that decision for themselves, is a way to get it done in a bipartisan way.
And what do you think the Republican case for cannabis reform is?
Well, it's federalism. I think that's the number one case, but also having responsible guardrails, setting a regulatory framework. It's already happening in 47 of 50 states, have some form of CBD or medical or recreational use. And so if we treat cannabis like alcohol, it's turnkey. You can legalize it overnight if you do it just like alcohol, which makes a lot of sense because the framework is already there. But other provisions that I think that is the Republican case for it is ensuring that where it's fully legalized for recreational, that we have markers in place, incentives in place, financial incentives that prohibit states from marketing and advertising to kids. And so if those who are concerned about cannabis legalization, having some guardrails in there, taking away maybe that's infrastructure funding, for example, is what I have in the States Reform Act, is if you're going to have something that looks like an Oreo or a Skittles or candy, then you're going to get money taken away, federal dollars from you, if you have it marketed in a way that's going to be attractive to children. That's something that is a Republican case for it. The other part of it, the third part of it, I would say, are veterans issues. If you are a veteran with PTSD or chronic pain because of your injuries from serving your country, if you were literally willing to take a bullet for our country, you should be able to be prescribed medical cannabis at any VA across the country, reducing veteran suicides, reducing veteran addiction to drugs, helping veterans get through the challenges they have, including veteran homelessness. I mean, small doses of THC can go a long way to improving the quality of life, the work life for our veterans who've suffered so much. And so if you care about our veterans, if you care about our children, if you care about federalism and the rights of states to make their own decisions, that is the Republican case for States Reform Act and legislation like it.
And what steps need to be taken to provide access to medical cannabis for veterans now? What legislation is required to make those changes?
Well, States Reform Act has a provision in it that would allow any veteran to get a prescription for medical cannabis anywhere in the country, regardless of state law. So we can do that through federal legislation. And I have it included in the States Reform Act. And that's an issue, that we're looking at, even separating it out for the next Congress. We're going to do a comprehensive bill, but if comprehensive won't pass, what are some ways that we can at least move the ball forward? And I will tell you, any panel or discussion or speech I give to veterans, as soon as I bring up medical cannabis, we don't talk about anything else. Particularly with our veterans who are wounded or suffer from PTSD. Once you start talking about cannabis, they don't want to talk about anything else. It's such an important issue to them. We are doing an enormous disservice to our service members who are willing to risk their life, risk everything for us, by not giving them access to something that can literally save their life. And so that's something that we're looking at as well, doing a standalone bill next legislative session, if we can't get it done through a comprehensive bill.
What do you think the prospects are in a Republican-controlled House for moving forward? And if you just do so incrementally, is that would that be your top priority and sort of the most doable of all the provisions you're fighting for, the veterans component?
My preference is comprehensive, but if in a Republican-controlled House, that's not what we can get, then we must look at incremental reforms Safe banking is passed out of the House a number of times. It's getting held up in the Senate. And so some of what we've done, we can do whatever we want in the House, but if it doesn't pass the Senate, it doesn't matter. And so there is some work that we need to do, some advocacy that needs to happen on the Senate side to get them on board. Safe banking is easy, low-hanging fruit, but you can't just stop there. I mean, the taxes are so high in some of these states. You've got to look at ways to make sure it's a more business-friendly environment, that businesses can get access to financing and lending, and you can't do that without descheduling or rescheduling at the very minimum. And there's some talk about doing rescheduling. There's talk about getting folks out of prison, but that just doesn't go far enough. And so if we have to do it incrementally, that may be the best way to go about it in a Republican-controlled House. Not my preference. I want to do it all. I want to do it all at once. But if that's what we have to do in limited measure to get progress, that's what we're going to do. And we're going to continue to lead on this issue, figuring out ways to navigate majorities in the Senate and in the House.
And as a leader in this fight, what are the hurdles that you found, what are the challenges to convincing your colleagues as you have these conversations and you make the case with specificity and all of the data? What are the sort of final hurdles, even though it's popular in all these states and the laws are changing so quickly? What do you find you bump up against among the holdouts?
Well, people are afraid of their base. Republicans are, but so are Democrats. And there should be no fear. You're not going to lose your Republican primary because you're pro-cannabis. And I've just proved that with ads that were being run against me. It is a very popular issue, even with the base, even with Republicans. So to my Republican colleagues, I say to them, go poll the issue in your district. Go do a poll for a couple $1,000s and see where your Republicans are. They're going to be with you, particularly on responsible reforms, state-led reforms, reforms that focus on federalism, reforms that focus on being responsible to our kids and our veterans. It is enormously popular with the vast majority of Republicans if you do it in that way. And so that's where I say to people, and even some of the pro-cannabis people that aren't on the States Reform Act, I'm like, what are you waiting for? This is an issue that you've run on, that you've talked about, and yet, you're unwilling to get on the legislation. Well, that's not right either. And so I've been willing to work with anyone who's willing to work with me on either side of the aisle, because it's something that is a personal passion of mine. I am a true believer in it. I've seen its benefits in my own life. And we are doing a disservice to the American people by sitting on our hands and doing absolutely nothing. And I blame both sides of the aisle. I blame Republicans and I blame Democrats for making a lot of promises and not following through on them. And it is high time, or past time, no pun intended or pun intended, to do something on this. Quit talking about it, put your money where your mouth is, and let's move forward in a responsible way. And so that's where we got to be in the next legislative session. We're going to be working really hard to try to make some progress, some movement to move the ball forward.
And finally, how are you just feeling about the momentum? More ballot initiatives being passed, a lot of momentum growing in the states, but you've talked about the hurdle and the problem being Washington. What's your faith in making progress on this soon? Do you think that something's going to happen in the lame duck session or in the next cycle of Congress, or do you think that this might still be a battle at the federal level years from now?
We're trying to look at what movement we can get in the lame duck session, doing some amendments or attaching some provisions to some legislation. We're working on that as well. But the biggest thing for us is educating members of Congress, showing them data. When they say that violent crime goes up because of legalization, well, that's just not true. And showing them the data, showing them the Journal of American Medicine articles that have been out there for over a decade that show when you have one dispensary in one state, the rate of opioid addiction is drastically reduced by upwards of 20%, between 18 and 20%, as an example, when you have just one dispensary in one state. And so showing them the data that they're on the wrong side of history, this is moving forward with or without them, and that they really should get on board. Otherwise, they're doing a great disservice to those that they serve, including our veterans, including our kids, including those that are seriously ill and could benefit from dosages of THC, regardless of what it's for. And so But I think educating members is probably the greatest challenge, and showing them that they don't need to be afraid of being on board with this issue. You might hear from a couple people who don't like it, but by and large, it's not relevant to the discussion. It's not relevant to reelection. You can win reelection by being supportive of responsible reforms at the federal level.
Congresswoman Mace, thank you so much for a fascinating discussion.
Thank you so much for talking about it. It's so important. And the hearing we had on oversight a couple weeks ago was historic and really helped us move the conversation forward. But we gotta get off the seat and move and start walking and running with this issue.
That wraps up our program for today. I want to thank our guests, Representatives David Joyce, Brian Mast, and Nancy Mace. And I want to thank the Coalition for Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation for their support of today's program. You can find out more about today's topic and rewatch this program at RealClearPolitics.com/the GOP case for cannabis. And thank you for watching. Until next time, for Real Clear Politics, I'm A.B. Stoddard.